Chapter 5. Bows and Arrows. From the Hollister's high perch at the top of the Ferris wheel, the net below them looked much smaller than it actually was. The fire captain shouted up again, "Jump!" "Here I go!" Ricky yelled. Mrs. Hollister put an arm around his shoulder and kissed him. "Be very careful and jump straight," she warned. Ricky took a deep breath and stepped off into space. Down, down he went, the wind whistling past his ears. Then, with a soft thud, he hit the net. After bouncing a few feet into the air, he settled into the net and scrambled to the edge. "Ricky, that was wonderful," Pam cried, hugging him. As the onlookers shouted and clapped, Pete said with a grin, "It was just like in the circus." Ricky stuck out his chest. "I think I'll be a high-wire man someday." Holly had been watching carefully. When she saw that her brother had landed safely, she stood up, ready to go next. With her pigtails flying, she hurtled downward and landed in the net. Again, cheers arose from the crowd as Holly was lifted out. "You children have no fear at all," a woman praised them as Pam hugged her sister. I was a little scared," Holly admitted, as she looked up at her mother and Sue. Mrs. Hollister was holding the little girl in her arms. A second later, she came whizzing down and landed squarely in the middle of the net. They gave 2 bounces and then were helped to the ground by a friendly fireman. As the applause died down, several people shook hands with Mrs. Hollister, praising her family's bravery and saying how glad they were it had not been necessary for her children to stay in the Ferris wheel all night. She smiled a little breathlessly, brushed her hair back in place, and thanked them. Then she added laughingly, "I think my 3 younger children have had enough excitement for one day, and me too. We'd better go home." She turned to Pete and Pam. "You may stay and help Indy if you like. Dad will come later and pick you up." The children decided to remain at the fair. After the others had left, they made their way back to Indy's booth. A few customers were there, examining the unusual items, and Indy had already made several profitable sales. When he saw the children, he smiled. "I'm glad you came back," he said. "Business is good and I need your help." Pete and Pam stepped behind the counter. As the lovely Indian articles were purchased, they wrapped them. During a lull a half hour later, they were surprised to see their father walking toward them. "Dad, how did you get here?" Pam asked, knowing that Mrs. Hollister could not have reached home to give him the station wagon. Her father explained that the store had a large order of nails to deliver to a carpenter who was building a house not far from the fairgrounds. "So I brought them over in the truck," Mr. Hollister said. "Dad, you should have been here to see the excitement," Pete said, and told of the Ferris wheel incident. When he finished, Mr. Hollister laughed. "What a family of daredevils I have." Then he added, "You children must be hungry. I'll take you to lunch. How about joining us, Indy?" The Yumathan said he was hungry too and would like to join them. He packed the articles that were left and locked them up. Mr. Hollister found a pleasant outdoor restaurant at the edge of the fairgrounds, where they ordered soup and sandwiches. When they finished and were on the way back to the booth, Pete stopped them at an archery range. "Wait! Let's see how an Indian can shoot," the boy said. At first, the athlete was reluctant to try his skill. "When I was a boy, I could shoot pretty straight," he said, "but I haven't done this in many years." "Oh, please," Pam urged. Indy stepped into the booth. Picking up a bow and an arrow, he took aim, then let go. The arrow whizzed into the center of the target. "Crickets!" Pete shouted. "You haven't forgotten a thing about shooting." The Yumathan smiled and shot another arrow into the golden center of the target. Then he scored 2 more very close to it. "Now you try your luck, Pete," Indy suggested, paying the attendant. The boy's first arrow fell short, and the next went over the target. "Wow," Pete exclaimed. "I really need some practice." He fitted another arrow into the bowstring. As it landed far back of the target, he saw a boy sneak out from behind some bushes to grab the fallen arrow. "Joey Brill!" Pete cried out. He would do something like that. The attendant ordered Joey off the archery range. Scowling, the boy walked back a distance but stood watching as Pete prepared to shoot again. "Ah, you're no good," Joey shouted. "You couldn't hit the side of a barn 10 feet away." The taunt made Pete nervous. He laid down his bow and took a deep breath. Then, picking it up again, he took aim once more and twanged the bow. Joey, thinking Pete had given up, dashed out to grab more arrows from the grass just as Pete shot. Pam screamed and Mr. Hollister yelled, "Look out! Duck!" Pete was paralyzed with fright as the arrow sped directly over the target toward Joey's back. Then he gulped in relief as Joey fell flat on the ground and the arrow zinged above him. "That crazy boy!" the attendant shouted, running toward him. But Joey, scared, scrambled to his feet and raced off into the crowd. The man turned back, saying, "Well, I'm glad we're rid of him." He offered Pete a few more shots, but the boy decided he'd had enough. The scare had left him a bit unnerved. As they left the booth, Pam thought of something to take his mind off Joey. She whispered to her father, and when he nodded, she turned to her brother. "The rodeo's going to start in a little while," she said. "Why don't you go with Dad and watch it? I'll help Indy." Pete grinned. "That would be swell." "You go too, Pam," Indy insisted. "I can take care of the booth alone. Most of the pieces have been sold already." "All right." The children said goodbye and set off with their father. The rodeo was being held in a field at the edge of the fairgrounds. On one side was a barn with a fenced-in yard and several large pens. Around the other 3 sides were wooden bleachers. Mr. Hollister bought tickets, and the 3 went in. Presently, several steers were released. Then, with whoops and shouts, the cowboys rode out, lassoing them and doing all sorts of rope tricks. Finally, it was time for the Brahmin bull riding contest. The gate to one of the pens was raised, and out lunged a huge black bull, with a cowboy astride his back. The bull stopped short, throwing the rider over his head. As the man rose to his feet, another bull with a rider charged into the center of the ring, bucking and jumping up stiff-legged. In a moment, the fellow on his back went flying into the dust. "This is terrific," Pete exclaimed. "Those cowboys didn't last long. Say, look over there on the rail of that pen. An Indian is trying to get on the next bull." "It's Warhorse," Pam cried. The bull stomped so furiously that Warhorse could not mount him. The Indian decided to try calming the animal. Climbing down the rails, he walked into the ring and pulled something from his pocket. "It's a snake," Pam exclaimed, as the Indian brandished the reptile in front of the bull. "He said our silver snake ring was good luck," Pete ventured. "Maybe he's trying to charm the bull." As he quickly told his father about the strange Indian, Warhorse put the snake back into his pocket and climbed the rails of the pen. The bull had quieted down, so the Indian was able to jump on his back. "The snake did bring good luck," Pam giggled. "But who'd want a live snake in his pocket?" "Not a girl," Pete grinned. The gate was raised, and in a flash the bull dashed to the center of the ring. He wheeled, tossed, and lowered his head and kicked out his hind legs. But Warhorse hung on grimly. The Indian held his right hand high in the air as the bull violently tried to unseat him. "He'll win the prize," Pete shouted. "He's staying on longer than any of the others." Just then a bell rang. The contest was over. The Indian had won it. "Look what he's doing now," Pam said, as Warhorse leaped off the animal and drew the snake from his pocket. The Indian began to walk up and down in front of the audience, dangling the reptile and grinning. As he neared the section where the Hollisters were sitting, he suddenly tossed the snake toward the crowd. Several women and girls shrieked, and Pete shouted, "Look out, Pam, it's going to land in your lap!"